Welcome back to another episode of Queer Money Follow-Up. Typically, we tried to keep the Queer Money Follow-Ups light and fun, but today it's a little bit more serious. On episode 22 of the Queer Money Podcast, we were visited by our friend Brynne Conroy of Femme, Frugality, because she brought to our attention something that we weren't, quite honestly, we weren't aware of. We were kind of naive on this topic, and that is the topic of domestic violence in the queer community. If you've listened to our podcast at all, you might be familiar with Brynne because she's been on our podcast a couple of times. In fact, she came on Queer Money Podcast episode 141 when she published her book, The Feminist Financial Handbook, because she included a whole section on trans women challenges with finances and money. So we were grateful to have her on that particular episode. But on this particular episode, 22, we covered domestic violence and abuse in the LGBT community, specifically financial abuse. So as we kick off, our question to you is, do you think that domestic abuse is more or less common in the LGBTQ community relative to the general population?
It is an interesting topic. I think that there's a lot of discussion around domestic violence and domestic abuse, especially towards women. And we have seen not only the discussion of it, we've seen it play out in movies and in TV shows. We've heard it talked about on a variety of different platforms. So it's something that I think is very prevalent in our consciousness, that there's domestic violence towards women, domestic abuse towards women. But what we're curious about, or what Brynne brought to our attention, was the prevalence of it in the LGBTQ community. And we were quite surprised by the data that she brought to us back then, but even the data that's available now is really surprising. But before we get started, as always, we would appreciate if you gave this video a thumbs up, if you subscribe to this channel, and make sure you turn on notifications so that when we go live, you can join us in the conversation. We've been getting some comments while we were doing these lives, and we really appreciate that.
Exactly. So we looked at some stats, more recent stats compared to what we talked about in 2016 with Brynne about the LGBTQ community and domestic violence, specifically physical violence as defined, or domestic violence as defined by physical violence, stalking, or rape. And we were quite shocked by the numbers. From what we found, 26% of gay men experienced domestic violence, 37% of bisexual men, 44% of lesbian women, and 61% of bisexual women. That is quite shocking to me. Especially because we don't really talk about it that much.
Well, and what I find so interesting about this is if you break those numbers down, that means 1 in 4 gay men have experienced some form of physical violence, stalking, or rape from someone that they are in a relationship with. 37%, or roughly almost 4 in 10 bisexual men. And most of us have this image of these predators, physical and sexual violence, being men, right? Because that's the discussion that is constantly put in front of us. But what I think is so surprising about this data is that it's even more common for women in lesbian relationships than it is for gay men in gay relationships to be victims of
and perpetrators of. So a community of women who consistently talk about this violence against women are also a community that, sadly it seems, are also perpetrators. And it's a little surprising to see how common it is, because that was specifically lesbians versus gay men. Mm-hmm. It's significantly lower for gay men to be perpetrators of violence towards their partners. And I think when you take all of that in totality, not only is that in and of itself shocking, but what we were able to find was that only fewer than 5% of LGBTQ people seek protective orders against violent domestic abuse.
Right. Which I think that there's probably a lot of reasons there, right? Mm-hmm. I can imagine for gay men, They don't want to be seen as weak. They also don't maybe don't want to call out their partner. I know of a couple that had domestic violence issues between the two of them. They actually perpetrated it on each other, so it wasn't necessarily. I think it was more of mutual attacking on each other on a regular basis. But I think that sometimes there is this idea that we have to portray ourselves as confident and strong in our relationships, and sometimes that may mean that we are not seeking that kind of protection that the law does provide against an abusive partner.
Well, and I think I can imagine being a gay man, that if I was being assaulted at home, that I would be afraid to maybe go to a police station and dealing with all the alpha males, not only having to disclose, hey, I'm gay, especially if you're in a more rural town. Hey, I'm not only am I gay, but I'm also being physically abused by my partner, and it just kind of it's a sort of a paradigm that maybe we're not necessarily comfortable with ourselves, and so we're less likely to seek out the help from the alpha males who are at the police force.
Right.
We also talked about on this episode how there might be a general mutually agreed upon silence in the community because we don't want to add more stigma to our community. We don't want to draw more negative attention to our community. So we just kind of something that we sort of sweep under the rug.
And I wonder if that is what has maybe precipitated the overall more, the fact that this happens more in the queer community. Domestic violence and domestic abuse is more common in the queer community than it is in the straight community. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's very, very interesting, that we are less likely to seek protection, which means we're less likely then probably to call out the abusive patterns or habits of certain individuals. And if we escape that relationship for whatever reason, that person then does not believe that their actions are inappropriate. They may go be a perpetrator against someone else.
So they never learn in a way, so to speak. But much of this particular discussion with Brynne on episode 22 of the Queer Money podcast focused on financial abuse, because it's a money podcast, and financial abuse is sort of a subtopic that's not really talked about that much in general, let alone specifically within the LGBTQ community. And Brynne brought some interesting stats. She said at the time that 94 to 99% of the time, there's physical and sexual abuse. There's also financial abuse.
Right.
And oftentimes, financial abuse can be a precursor to pending physical or sexual abuse.
Right. And I do remember one of the things that was brought up in here is that really in this kind of situation, whether it's the financial abuse, the emotional abuse, the physical abuse, the sexual abuse, all of this is a way in which the perpetrator tries to exercise dominance or power over one another individual. And we talked about how sometimes the financial abuse is not necessarily what you would think it is. So we had the example of someone that we had worked with in the past who was the quote-unquote breadwinner, but they were basically being financially abused by their partner because their partner was heaping on them obligations to work full-time while they stayed home and shopped during the day. They didn't work. They worked from time to time, but didn't maintain a job, but at the same time would emotionally abuse the individual who was the breadwinner, saying that they were not a competent breadwinner because this individual couldn't buy. This individual had a penchant for
Louis Vuitton bags.
Louis Vuitton, right? It was Louis Vuitton bags and high-end fashion products, right? And so here was this individual who was not working, but demanding that the breadwinner bring home enough money so that they could maintain this habit. And so what sometimes we think of as maybe abuse or financial abuse, emotional abuse, may not appear that way. It may have appeared that this individual was forcing his husband to stay home, because he didn't want him to work, when in reality it was just the opposite.
Well, and I think to your point earlier, we have sort of this stereotype of what abuse looks like. And I think because of that, we've all sort of become conditioned to think that there is just one version of abuse.
Right.
But there are as with sexual orientations and gender identity, there are myriad versions of physical, emotional, verbal abuse. And they're not always clean cut. They don't all follow the typical stereotypes. And sometimes you really kind of have to dig deep. I never really thought of, when we were working with this couple, saw it as a form of financial abuse. I never really thought of it as financial abuse at all. But I can see how, in hindsight, it probably was.
Right.
And I can see how, especially, there's a lot of, we do polls in the Queer Money Facebook group a lot. And very often we have the answers, we're asking people, like, if one thing magical could happen to you in the next year, what would the case be? And people say something to the effect of, "Oh, my Prince Charming will come and take care of me. My Prince Charming will help make all my debt go away. My Prince Charming this, my Prince Charming that." And it's somewhat comical, but I think there is a sort of sense among some gay men that they need to find somebody to take care of them, and they're a queen, and it might we kind of laugh it off. It's somewhat comical. We see it in TV and movies, and we see versions of it played out in the general population, not just the LGBTQ community. But there may be some, it could be that they find the right beta male that they can be the alpha male to,
Right.
and say, "I'm just going to lie on the couch here, eat bonbons and watch Oprah while you get me all my Louis Vuitton bags. You keep this roof over my head and you make sure I eat."
Right. There are, like you said, there are varieties of what this might look like. But I think we want to maybe caution that sometimes we may confuse what is someone with a right mindset, especially when it comes to finances, someone with the right mindset of wanting to move the couple in the right direction. Mm-hmm. We talked about this today on a podcast we recorded with Andy Hill, who is the podcaster of Marriage, Kids, and Money. And he talked about how when he and his wife first sat down and he wanted to talk about money, he approached it from the wrong way. He didn't approach it from the words and the desires in which his wife would understand and want to
resonate with.
Right, it didn't resonate with her. And so sometimes if your desire is to move in the right direction financially, it may seem like someone is trying to control you. So be cautious when you are trying to get on the same page financially with your partner, that you are open and honest with, this is what your desire is. You want you both to work together as a team to make this happen, and that will engender, or hopefully engender, that individual to want to work with you.
Yeah. So, for example, in a few seconds, we're going to share 7 signs of financial abuse. One of the signs of financial abuse is that your dominating partner, the perpetrator, is monitoring your spending. And they're not necessarily, that could be, seen as 2 ways. Obviously, you definitely want to monitor your spending to help control your spending so you don't overspend. You continue to vector your finances towards your goals and covering your bills. But then that can go to the extreme where it's monitoring to control someone.
Right.
And so you want to be crystal clear that, you're not calling out somebody who's just managing the finances and monitoring the finances to maintain fiscal responsibility. You're not accusing them of being a domestic abuser, like you would somebody who is monitoring finances to be controlling.
Right.
So before we proceed with those 7 tips, again, give this video a thumbs up if you like these conversations that we're having. Subscribe to this YouTube channel and set notifications on this channel so you can join us real time, like some folks have done recently with Queer Money follow-up discussions. Yeah. So the 7 signs of, not the only signs, but the 7 dominant signs of financial abuse are these. 1, they give you an allowance. They budget without your input. Right. And I think this is another one that could be misconstrued. My mom and dad, my dad has been, my mom and dad work on their finances together all the time. My dad is pretty much the leader in the finances, and he gives my mom a budget, but it's an agreed upon budget.
Right.
It's agreed upon allowance. And As we learned just the other day, she's got her own little side money, and then sometimes she uses it to pay my dad back for different things. So, but that's an agreed upon relationship. So, but if you're being restricted with your spending, especially if you can afford to spend more, because someone's trying to control you, that's when it kind of crosses the line.
Right. Well, and there you hit it on the head there. All 7 of these, if you look at them, you can say, is this a partnership or is this a controlling situation?
Right.
Right. So 1, does your partner give you an allowance, or let me put it this way too. Are you the partner that is giving someone an allowance without their input, right? So we need to look at both sides. You may be, I'm not calling you out as a perpetrator, but we do need to call out individuals who are perpetrators, right? So this is one habit that you could be something that could be causing you to be, quote unquote, a perpetrator or looking to control.
Right.
Number 2 is one that I think is a pretty quick sign that if you see this happening, you know someone is trying to control you, and that is blocking your access to accounts.
Especially your own accounts.
Right. If you have a joint account, if your partner is blocking you, if you have your own accounts, if they have taken your passwords and changed them so you no longer have access to those, really the whole idea here is this individual is trying to prevent you from seeing the truth of what's really going on. That is their way of controlling you.
Well, and I think some people might dismiss it because the response might be, "We'll just call your brokerage firm or your bank and regain access to your accounts." But if financial abuse is just one of the abuses that you're dealing with, you're also dealing with physical and or emotional and or verbal abuse. You might not be inclined to call your bank or your brokerage firm to gain access to your accounts because it will lead to other consequences that you don't want to deal with.
Right.
Another, like as we said earlier, one of the number 3 is that they monitor your spending in a controlling way, not in a way to manage your finances in a fiscally responsible way.
Right. I think one of the other things here is that this could call out also financial infidelity, and that is someone who is hiding their spending because they don't want it to be monitored. Right? That also is a controlling situation where you're trying to control the truth of the individual who is trying to possibly bring the family into a better financial situation.
Right, and we definitely have that. We've had that experience in our own family. Not our family personally, our extended family. Yeah. Then number 4 is that they apply for debt or other brokerage or banking or money products in your name, especially debt, because that can oftentimes have adverse consequences on your credit report, then your credit score, and that can really just make life for you make it really challenging for you, especially if you try to leave the relationship, and then your records are completely sabotaged.
Right.
So that's definitely something you want to be aware of.
Yeah. Number 5 also has a very damaging effect on you as an individual, and that's sabotaging your career or your ability to earn money. That sometimes this is the way that they can then, so to speak, keep you under their, I don't want to say wing, because wing is like more protective, but keep you under their control.
Right.
If you cannot earn money and you have to rely on them, or they're able to some way damage your ability to earn enough to live on your own and get away from them, then they have that control over you. So some examples of this may be interfering with your relationship with your job, maybe saying things or putting things out there that would make it appear that you are not a good employee. So all of that could damage your ability or your potential ability to earn more.
Exactly. Number 6 is what we alluded to earlier, and that they make you pay for or subsidize their lifestyle. It's not an agreed upon partnership. It's sort of a burden that they've put on you. And if you're not in the right space, it can be something that's very controlling while they are pretty much leeching off of all of your efforts.
Yeah, it was interesting because this specific example was brought up in the podcast that we did with Chad Nash. I think that was Queer Money episode number 5, where he talked about towards the end of his relationship with his partner. Here was Chad, who had started a business, had built up a relatively nice lifestyle, owned a home with a nice pool, several nice vehicles, and his partner was taking credit for the nice things that they had by saying that he bought them, when in reality he didn't even have a job. He purchased them, he didn't buy them, but he was portraying to everyone that he was the one doing this. So he was, in a sense, putting himself in a controlling situation, a damaging situation to Chad. So not only just paying for the lifestyle, but also portraying to others that you are the one who has been able to buy this, when really it's someone else's. That can actually be demeaning to your partner.
Exactly. And then number 7 might be pretty obvious, and that is that they simply steal your money. They steal your credit cards and use your debt. They steal your the cash in your account. And that's a pretty obvious one. But it can be a problem to distinguish between that and managing an account together if both of your names are on a particular account.
Yeah.
If legally, if both there are 2 names on an account, that's the most of the laws see that as a 50-50 account. If in the back of your minds, one account is yours and another account is theirs, even though both your names are on both accounts, that not necessarily how the law sees it. So that you can run into some problems there. But a pretty obvious one is number 7, in that they steal your funds.
Yeah. And we actually had we've had several people in the Queer Money Facebook group